I had not seen Salim Raufov in 20 years. We had exchanged only a handful of sporadic emails over the decades. His last messages described a simple life alone in a yurt on the Kazakh steppe. He wrote that he had left the city for good. He wanted to return to the old ways of his ancestors. When the next email said simply "come visit," I booked my flight the same day. The journey from New York took me across time zones and vacant landscapes. After a long flight to Almaty, I took a train south through an endless yellow plain. At Kazilorda station I hired a local driver with a rattling old Lada. We drove 200 kilometers east until the asphalt turned to gravel, then to dirt. The driver stopped at a shallow gully and refused to go further. I paid him, shouldered my backpack, and walked into the absolute silence. The steppe stretched to every horizon like a dried ocean floor. Nothing grew higher than my knee, and a single column of smoke rose in the distance. I walked for more than an hour towards that smoke. Gradually a yurt appeared, a small felt cone pinned against the blank sky. Near it, a man crouched by a fire, almost invisible, and it was Salim. He did not stand or wave. He was stirring a large soot-blackened cauldron with his bare hands. Both arms were plunged up to the elbows into the bubbling liquid. I could see the broth churning, steam rising around his wrists. Inside, chunks of boiled lamb and horse meat tumbled among thick homemade macaroni. Slices of carrot and rings of onion bobbed in the greasy surf. There was no elegance to the dish, no careful arrangement. It was simply a chaotic, boiling mess of everything together. Salim finally raised his head and looked at me with tired eyes. He said, "Wait a little, the beshbarmak is not ready yet." Then he jerked his chin toward the felt door of the yurt. I hesitated only a second, then walked inside. I pushed aside the greasy felt flap and stepped inside. The smell hit me at once: dry, dank smoke, old grease, and a deep animal musk. Daylight barely filtered through the smoke hole in the ceiling. The circular space was cluttered with piles of faded rags, old saddle parts, and splintered crates. In the very center, an iron stove glowed red through its cracks. Its belly was full of burning kizyak, dried horse droppings crumbling to powdery ash. Beside the stove sat an ancient computer rig without any tower case. A dusty motherboard with a socket 775 was exposed to the air. Thick cobwebs breached the capacitors and the CPU fan. The monitor beside it, a chunky CRT, displayed the World of Warcraft login screen. A level 60 night elf stood forever in the Darnassus forest. I remembered playing Warcraft with Salim back in college 20 years ago. The sight made my chest tighten with something like grief. On a heap of old carpets near the wall, an enormous wild boar snored. Its bristly flanks rose and fell in a slow rhythm. A tiny field mouse darted across a mountain of Chinese shipping boxes. Each box was stamped with cryptic red characters and covered in clear packing tape. Some boxes were torn open, spilling cheap plastic watches and tangled cables. I noticed a large flat package leaning against the wall unopened. It had a picture of a television on its side. I reached down and let the mouse sniff my finger. It did not flee, so I gently stroked its back with my knuckle. The boar stirred, opened one small intelligent eye and grunted. I remembered the Snickers bar from the duty-free shop in Almaty. I peeled the red wrapper and held the chocolate under its massive snout. The boar took it with surprising delicacy and began to chew. A strange wave of exhaustion washed over me without warning. Maybe it was a jet lag, maybe the heavy sweetish fumes from the Kiziak stove. My eyelids became as heavy as wet wool. I slumped onto a pile of old sacks near the stove. The last image I remember was the boar chewing the candy and the mouse vanishing, then everything went black. A sudden jolt of awareness pulled me from nothing. My digital watch showed exactly 3 in the morning. The yurt was freezing, so I tossed a handful of Kiziak onto the dying embers. A rich, savory smell drifted in from outside. It was the most delicious thing I had ever inhaled. I crawled to the entrance and stepped out into the moonlit steppe. Salim was still there, squatting on his heels before the fire. His posture had not changed in 6 hours. His arms were still elbow deep in the boiling cauldron, stirring slowly. I walked over and crouched beside him. He did not acknowledge me, and the broth bubbled with the same chaotic mix of meat and noodles. Then, without a word, Salim reached into a canvas sack at his feet. He pulled out a white rabbit, its feet thrashing. He held it over the bubbling surface for a moment. Then he lowered the creature into the boiling stew. The rabbit let out a thin, terrible shriek. I could not move as Salim slowly turned his head toward me. His eyes were completely blank, like 2 holes. He said, "You are next." The words hit my brain a second later. I scrambled backward, got my feet under me and burst into the yard. I remembered the flat box I had noticed earlier. I grabbed its edge and heaved it against the felt entrance. It was heavier than I expected, a plasma television. I wedged it tight, sealing the door. Outside I heard Salim walk up slowly. His footsteps stopped right on the other side of the felt. He said, "Beshbarmak is almost ready. Come out." I did not answer. I snatched the wired keyboard from the computer table. I held it like a club, ready to smash. The yurt remained silent except for the crackle of the stove. I fed another dry Kiziak into the fire with trembling hands. Time crawled as Salim repeated his invitation every hour. His voice never rose, never wavered. I spent the dark hours with my back to the wall, clutching the keyboard. When the first grey light seeped through the smoke hole, I heard nothing more. I waited until the light was full and brave. I pushed the plasma TV aside just enough to peer out. The morning sun blazed over the endless empty steppe. Salim was gone. The fire pit was cold and the cauldron lay overturned. A few soggy noodles clung to the dry ground. There was no sign of him anywhere. The motor block with its rusty trailer stood exactly where I had seen it. I did not think about keys or fuel. I climbed onto its cracked seat, pulled the starter cord, and the diesel coughed to life. I drove south, bouncing over the great dirt track for what felt like hours. I did not look back once, and soon the distant silhouettes of Kizilorda rose against the sky. I left the motor block at the edge of town and walked into the first cheap guest house I found. I paid a tired woman at the desk for a week in cash, no questions. Now I sit in this rented room on a narrow side street. I have not left the room, and I jump at every footstep in the hallway. My hands still tremble as I write down every detail of that night. I can still smell the Beshbarmak on my jacket. Those words repeat endlessly. You are next. Well, as usual, I found this story on the dark net. I think the narrator is lying and not telling the truth. I don't understand why he refused to eat Beshbarmak and what scared him. In my opinion, the author is just a fool. If you think the same, then subscribe to my channel and watch my other videos. This was Creepy Dark Horror TV. Bye everyone.